It is your weekly program that allows Barbadians the opportunity to share that rich history and heritage of their communities and so enrich the lives of all of us. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thanks for joining us. This is My Community. Hal Gollop ended last week's program by sharing experiences of Hurricane Janet. As we begin this week, he will share more experiences, this time pleasant experiences, at a time when he was enrolled in the community's primary school.
The primary school, as I said, was Ebenezer Boys. And you traveled across a track between the canes, which we called the Long Road. That was the name we gave it. You're going across the Long Road. And we journeyed from Burton to Ebenezer along that long road. And our mother, invariably, because the fathers were out, the mothers met us for lunch. And you would sit on the hedgerow of a cane field, and your mother brought your lunch to you between 12 and 1, lunchtime. It used to be called breakfast time in those days. Lunch now, what we call lunch now, is something else. Breakfast time, nowadays we speak when you get up and you have your breakfast. Breakfast was 11 to 12. And the school time was the parents brought your lunch at 12 to 1. And of course it was an open school. And I remember some of those teachers of those days, one of whom lived right in the village, Mrs. Hooper. She occupied a house right there where that star block plant is. That star block plant forms a very significant part of Burton. A number of things were centered around there. Mrs. Hooper, she lived there, the village school teacher. And she was the mother of the postmistress, Mrs. Agnes Wason, who lived there up to some point and then moved on. But the school was a different kind of place, of course. You went to school. You got there, had to get there in time. You went to school, most of us barefooted, ran across the long road and back on evenings. And you had to learn in an open school. And there were certain things that were characteristic of that school. Every morning, you got in line, and they tested whether you'd combed your hair, and the school had to see, and your nails and so on. Those tests were carried out. And my man, we boys with the black hair, black people's hair, if you didn't comb it, you learned that you don't come to school not combing your hair, because the comb from upstairs will be brought down. And some little boys will be almost lifted off their feet when you pull that comb through the hair. So you didn't want to suffer that twice. And certain basic lessons were taught. The motto was, cleanliness is next to godliness. That was the kind of motto which was taught in the school. And there were some other things which were characteristic of the school in those days. Singing was an important element of the school curriculum. And you had this communal singing, often conducted by the headmaster of the school, with his tuning fork, who would come in, and he would strike up, and we would sing all these various songs. Of course, a lot of them were songs of the empire, which we sang. But singing was something which was a hallmark of the school curriculum in the primary school. And that went on for many years. You could not come out of school not having been exposed to singing. As a matter of fact, if you couldn't hold a tune, you were one of the people in the minority. And boys were I mean, encouraged to sing. And that culture was something which the church choirs benefited from. For example, the boys in the choir at St. Philip's Parish Church, for example, where they had the all-male choirs, because we don't see it now, and it's, regrettably it's a thing of the past, where the boys' choir in the church has gone. I believe the last remnants were at St. Michael's Cathedral some years ago in the 70s, the late 70s. We had a full all-male choir there, but all the major churches had all-male choirs where the boy treble led the singing. And the beauty of the boy's voice was appreciated, because the boy's voice is a different kind of voice. It is at its purest between, say, age 8 and 12, when pubescence and adolescence sets in. The voice cracks, and he then develops a kind of voice which he would have as an adult. But that boy treble, that boy's voice in the choirs all over Barbados was fostered by what happened in the primary schools. There was a lot of singing. There was a lot of singing. We've lost that. We've lost that. Unfortunately, nobody has seen that it is important enough to get boys singing. They're doing other things. I've got my own views about it. There are other musical offerings and other types of singing which we are encouraging boys to get involved in, but it does not draw on the natural beauty of the boy's voice, which is at its purest between those ages about like 7 even, some of them can do it, from about 7 to 12, but just before 13. Everybody, I mean, who has an interest in choral music speaks of the College of King's College, Cambridge, especially at a time like now when we turn our televisions on and see the Christmas carol service and so on, and we hear the beauty of the boy's voice. That was a characteristic of Barbados 40 years ago.
That reinforces the important role played by community schools. Now, what about the service of song?
The service of song was a direct offshoot of the amount of singing that took place from the school up. Now, it also spoke of the way people were able to entertain themselves. Not canned entertainment. You turn on a record now or something, as we can do now, or a video, a cassette or something. People entertained themselves by making the music. So what did you have? Singing was an important element of the school curriculum. And the boys especially, as I said, and the men, as they grew older, because all of them were able to sing the solfa, became interested in music. And not only interested in music making. And there were these choirs that were led by these choir masters. And you would have a service of song. And the service of song was an event which would feature a choir. And they would sing hymns they would say they would be singing hymns from ancient and modern. But they also sang some gospel songs as well, 4-part offerings. And that formed part of the entertainment. And it would usually be a feature that was held on a Sunday evening. Up there where they were often held, at that building which I spoke to you about, the shop, that Martin Dorley building up there, often we would have service of songs, and you would hear the music, the singing is being provided by Mr. So-and-so's choir. And my father was a bassman in one of those choirs. And I could remember some of the persons from the village who sang in those choirs, who've now all passed on. I remember names like Mr. Douglas Prescott and the same Mr. Edwin Joe Boyd. I forget his second name. He's not Sergeant because it's, no, he's not Sergeant, but Douglas Prescott and some of these people, they sang in those choirs. Mr. Cyril Ford, he was a choir master there as well. And as little boys, we stood by and listened in amazement at how these people put together these choirs and provided entertainment. There was some liquid refreshment kept in the background always too. And the level of the singing might be affected by the intake of that liquid. But it was all in very, very, very good spirit and spirits that these service song choirs held these things. And then there was another thing which was less popular called a singing. And I remember going to a singing which my aunt had. That was less structured in that the people would come together and just sing. That was more everybody's situation. Somebody would raise a hymn and people would sing and join in that. All by way of entertainment. But the service of song was definitely a structured thing where choirs were trained, 4-part choirs, to provide that kind of entertainment. The singing was different. You would sing the hymns and all that, but very, very much a ad hoc kind of arrangement as compared to the service of song. Yes.
Now on to other aspects of social life and the things community members did to amuse and entertain themselves. Have you ever heard of a Dolly Wedding?
What I can tell you, in this village, we had a thing like a Dolly Wedding. And there was a lady who lived at the top of the village. Oh, she was like a village mother, Miss Rose. And all the children from that part of Britain, my top area, assembled at Miss Rose. And she would have a full wedding ceremony with dolls. And people would have these dolls in little homemade carts and things. And she would go through the full ceremony. Somebody would be acting as a priest and so on. At a Dolly wedding. I remember when I was a bigger boy, somebody tried to resurrect that tradition, which Mrs. Rose used to have there at the top of Britain. And I was even asked to be the priest at this Dolly wedding. Somebody tried to revive it. It didn't last. But those were things which were peculiar to villages. And that Dolly wedding was a thing which, as a boy growing up in Britain, that I found very, very well, interesting and became part of. We became part of it. It became part of our immediate environment up there, the Dolly wedding. So even though we didn't have the sophisticated Easter bonnet parade, we had things that were the equivalent of things like that. That meant something to the immediate society, the local society.
Oh yes, there's something special about community life of yesteryear. Speaking of community life, well, our guest, Hal Gollop, is an attorney at law by profession and a senior counsel. Perhaps he was inspired by a similar profession in his community when he was a child. Yes, in Britain, there was the doctor and the lawyer, and these individuals proudly engaged in their profession.
We had a village doctor. He was a doctor who performed little operations on animals and all kinds of things. Actually, his name was Doc. He was a relative, my mother's very close relative, Doc O'Neill. But this is one which I should would really, this one would enthuse you. We had a village lawyer who was typical of what in those days was referred to as a fireside lawyer. And he subsequently had 2 children who went off to Combermere. 2 of those boys went to Combermere, my brother told me. I knew them because they came back on the Combermere week thing. They migrated to America. And they were lawyers. So they fulfilled the father's frustration of not being a lawyer himself. And he was a village lawyer, and he used to assist people in cases. And he would go up to District C to try cases. And the story was given to me by an old friend of mine that same relative which I told you was a village doctor. Doc, we called him. I knew him. Doc used to occupy a parcel of land on my father's plot. He was my mother's relative, but he lived as a tenant on my father's land. But he was a bad behaved fella. And my father served notice on him. And he refused to leave, so my father, in good old parlance, put him in court. And he consulted the village lawyer, a man who was called Pittman Brathwaite. He was a Brathwaite. Pittman was his nickname. And Doc consulted Pittman to represent him in this matter. And Pittman said to him, look, I can't go up to represent you. I've got something to do on that day. But Pittman advised him what to go up and say to represent himself. And he went up to the station, to the court, to be tried for this ejectment thing which my father and some order he had floated. And the evening, Pittman was sitting at his window in the same house. It was a substantial house there, 2-story building. The pub occupied it in later years, that pub which we spoke about. Pittman saw him walking, coming down the road, saw Doc, and called somebody and says, come here, come here, come here. What happened with the case with Gollop and Doc? And the fellow told him, Doc get fined 5 shillings. He says, sir, that's all? And if he did remember half of what I tell you, he won't see the light of day. Pittman had set up poor Doc because Doc was a devil. Doc was a known devil in the place. Pittman said, that's all? Man, if you remember half I tell you, man, he wouldn't have seen the light of day. So that was the village. That was the village doctor and the village lawyer involved in that same episode. But all the villages had those people, and they played their part, because that Pittman Brathwaite, he was legendary. He was still around when I was a young boy growing up. But you hear the older fellas, man, tell of some of the stories with Pittman there practicing his law on them. It was something else.
Now, as it relates to the teaching profession, We must pause and recognize the good work of the village teacher who saw it as her responsibility to teach the entire village.
The thing about the village teacher too, Miss Hooper, she also continued her teaching privately at her house. So sometimes you had to spend a few hours in your vacation going to Miss Hooper for some lessons and so on. And that was characteristic of the villages. All the villages where there was a school nearby had a schoolmaster or a schoolmistress to whom you went during those breaks, and you had to spend a few hours in there sitting, learning your tables or something or the other. And she was right there in the village as the village schoolmistress, who also taught at Ebenezer. And there were those people in all the villages. Those people in all the villages. So the opportunity to develop you as a person was never spared. Whether it was through the church or through the school or an extension of the school by the school teachers who lived in the village. And that, our country has benefited significantly from that. Of course, we're in much more developed times where people have other means of educating their children privately and so on. But we must not forget the foundation laid by that kind of initiative, which was available in those early days for the village to have its children exposed to an education that took them away from the third-class gang, or whatever you called it. When I left primary level to go to Combermere, I went at age 9. So I had not yet even gone on to class 4. In my days, at that time, in my day, there was a preparatory class at Combermere, which I went at age 9. But a lot of boys who I left at school, primary school, and who finished school at age 11, 12, there was no secondary school. Some of them, parents of some of them could not have afforded to pay for them at a private secondary school. And Princess Margaret had not yet come along. So those boys, unfortunately, went over to Edgecombe or Bentley, as the case may be, in that junior gang. So that the founding of a school at Princess Margaret in this area was a major development for the neighboring villages. That was important for those boys who didn't go on to a secondary school or whose parents were not able to pay for them at a private secondary school. They were able to go to Princess Margaret and get a secondary education. But that is the kind of development which was favorable for us, the development of the country, and especially for the villages, especially these rural areas, where, were it not for schools like Princess Margaret, country schools like that, those country secondary schools, a lot of the youngsters would have had to go off and be robbed of an opportunity to develop themselves to their fullest potential.
The important role played by community schools. What about the village baker shop?
We had a village baker shop right there on that same spot by the church. It is on this side of the church. There was a baker shop there. There was a little boy going there to that baker shop because a friend of mine, his father was on the people who worked there. And when that was dismantled, you see the bricks, these clear bricks. And the fire, you would see these pans of bread fed into these things on large pallets and things like that. There was a village, there's definitely a village baker shop. And you would go there, especially on a Sunday evening, when he did most of his baking on a Sunday to supply the plantations and so on. People who went to take out refreshment to the field. And most of the produce, most of the bread he baked, he himself sold. But there was, like that other baker shop, they sold bread around the parts, around the villages and things. And then there was another much bigger baker in Church Village, a Mr. Ford, who had a baker shop. And he also had a cart, which a man brought out his bread to sell in the shops. So he was a baker on a bigger scale. So they moved from the ordinary baker on his modest oven and things like my aunt's husband to a bigger business which went out. That went out before my aunt's husband was baking that baker thing there, that baker shop with the brick iron, the brick oven and so on. And then you had the bigger one, Mrs. Sammy Ford in Church Village. But they provided the villages, the neighboring villages, with the bread. And of course, that was the real salt bread in those days, man, I tell you. You would get a salt bread who you would eat, man, for a whole week, and the salt bread don't go stale. But I don't know what to do with it these days. I don't know what they put in them or they do not put in them in these days. But the village baker. And you smells, man, around the place, of course, with the factory above there. There was also a peculiar smell that became part of the village. The cane juice, especially when it is boiled, and the syrup and the thing sweeping down this village. Those were all parts of the village sights and the village songs and the village smells from what the neighboring, the activity that took place in the village. So we grew up to be part of all of it and to appreciate it for what it was worth and what it meant to us and what it has meant to developing this whole little island, I mean, in one way or another. So, as I said, it is really very important that these programs are kept in the forefront so that succeeding generations can have some idea of the road to progress, if you want to call it that, which we have traveled, and to be more appreciative of the efforts of former generations, more appreciative and be more respectful. In that way, with a sense of knowledge and appreciation, my view is that you would be much more respectful and you will be a much more respectable person if you are conscious of the efforts of persons of former generations.
We could not agree with you more, Mr. Gollop. And for that reason, we shall continue our efforts of providing the platform for Barbadians to do just that, so that others could be more appreciative and respectful of other generations. Thank you very much, sir. It's been an interesting journey. Thank you very much, Mr. Gollop. This has been an extended session on the Britain community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. The program continues next week at the same time.
Babylon.